Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. In this episode, we'll be talking about innovations in how nonprofits raise money and engage donors. With the COVID-19 pandemic continuing to dramatically impact many traditional fundraising events, Canadian nonprofits are having to find new ways to raise much-needed operating funds. Virtual events and digital campaigns, including crowdfunding, are gaining ground as nonprofits and charities are transforming their fundraising with new tools and events. Please welcome Daryl Hatton, CEO of Connection Point. Daryl leads FundRazr, an innovative, award-winning global enterprise crowdfunding platform. And full disclosure for our audience, FundRazr is CharityVillage's partner for our new crowdfunding services that we launched in 2020 to help nonprofits during the pandemic. Welcome, Daryl.
Glad to be here, Barry. This is going to be fun.
Well, let's go back to the beginning of the pandemic. We saw that continued lockdowns were having a devastating effect on the ability of nonprofits and charities to fundraise. Can you describe what the sector faced and what you personally observed as the leader of FundRazr?
You know, it was really interesting because it felt like such a dark time. We were getting news of the pandemic. The epicenter of the outbreak in Canada was only a mile from my house, where the initial entrant came in. And so it felt very, very direct, very personal, very in our face. And the feedback that we were getting from our customers was the confusion point. They didn't know where they were going to how long this was going to last, how badly it would affect them. And then the lockdowns happened and they started to see the cancellations coming in, people not wanting to go to do a gala, not wanting to go do a golf tournament, being concerned for their safety and doing all that. And there was a fair bit of angst showing up of how are we going to fund this and how are we going to adapt? And I think there was a really interesting component of the charitable sector, which is sometimes moves fairly slowly, to adapt to that. They were coming in, they were brainstorming, figuring out how to change, to adapt, to try new things. And so there was actually quite a period of creativity there for some organizations. Some retrenched and felt at risk, and some really rose to the challenge and created some great results. And that was very enheartening and inspiring for others in the sector. We talked about it in webinars with Charity Village, and really were able to demonstrate some of the great things that have happened in the sector that motivated people to do more.
Well, you're so right. I mean, certainly we saw it at the beginning, that sort of huge shock and impact that happened. And then during all the later shutdowns that happened, the sector really had to accelerate its transformation in its fundraising strategies to really embrace more virtual events and online fundraising platforms, and of course, crowdfunding. What did you see from your perspective? Like, what kind of uptick did you see?
Well, yeah, it was very interesting because one of the things that happened at that time was many groups were reluctant to fundraise. They felt that they weren't the priority for the pandemic. You know, society is going through this. Our little cause isn't worthy. And so there was a lot of discussion of that to say, no, your cause is still worthy. Trust your donors to apply their lens on it. They'll decide what's important and they'll contribute to you or not in this time frame. So first off, we had to encourage people to go back and ask. And then the other thing that happened was they were trying to figure out this shift to digital donors. A lot of organizations were heavily reliant on in-person events for fundraising. And so the shift to digital donors was new to them. How to change the communication style, how to change the storytelling that's involved. There's quite a bit different ways to make online giving or digital giving effective, and they had to do a kind of a hurry up course on how to do all of that. So there was that component of it, and then there was just getting the systems in place. Many of them didn't have, they hadn't spent the time curating their email list, getting themselves a mechanism for communicating with their audience that was polished and easy to do. So there was a lot of struggles with new tools, new techniques, all at the same time.
Yeah, it was certainly an extremely challenging time for fundraising at the same time that a lot of increase in demand for many nonprofit services actually took place. Can you give us some real world examples of some of the achievements in fundraising that you saw happen during this time?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that was really kind of interesting, especially in that first March, April timeframe, was it felt almost like a wartime footing. And we collaborated with some of our causes very intensely. And one of them was Vancouver Sun Children's Fund. Now, they normally raise uh, about $1 million a year for school food programs, where they're helping feed the kids that are going to school. And they were concerned because no one was going to school. So was their program even needed? But they had the epiphany that the children were still going to be hungry. They just weren't going to go to school. So they worked with their community and their principals and others to help put together programs to help the kids who could come to the school staggered intervals and get fed, so that there was no shame involved in it, so that they could be safe in the pandemic. And we went out and started a fundraising campaign based on this pandemic response. They raised about over $850,000 for the pandemic response, and that inspired people to give to their regular program, and they raised over $1.4 million in the regular program. So they had a 40% lift on the year on their regular program, and then an 85% lift on their COVID campaign. And it was all virtual. So I think that was one of the best examples I saw of a very significant increase. And I believe they got there mainly because they had a first mover advantage. They decided to respond very quickly. It was within weeks. And as a result, they got really, really stellar results out of it all.
So it was almost an epiphany about how strong digital sort of solutions can be in terms of fundraising. Give us an idea of how your crowdfunding platform actually works.
Sure. I mean, crowdfunding is really about storytelling. A lot of it, and it's about social fundraising is about engagement. It's not necessarily about just publishing a page and hoping people will get there, but it's about having a conversation with the community in digital. So the thing about our platform is that it makes it easy for, I call them normal mortals, to be able to tell a really nice looking fundraising story. The editor there looks like a word processor. So it's really easy to put content in and to put videos in and photos and lay them all out, making it all look nice, and do a very good job of telling the story. And then, of course, sharing it out in social media, being able to share it on Facebook, share it on LinkedIn, share it on Pinterest, or something that's really become very important these days is what we call dark social or private social, being able to share it with Facebook Messenger or on WhatsApp, or even send it by text message. But so there's tools to do all of that. But one of the big things that we talk about in this kind of fundraising is donors have an expectation of more instant result. They're expecting to see the impact of their gift as quickly as possible. And so it's very important as part of the campaign pages to be able to keep that community updated on what's going on. And so we have a very strong update capability where someone can make post a little bit of story content on their campaign page, and it's automatically delivered out to people who have contributed or subscribed to that campaign. And so what it does is it automatically curates your mailing list for you, because one of the key things about crowdfunding is you may have more than one campaign at a time. For example, you might have one that's, we saw campaigns for pandemic supplies, cleaning supplies, PPE equipment, all that kind of thing. And then there was also the regular campaign for what was going on with the beneficiaries, their food program or their clothing program, their shelter program, whatever those things were. So you may have multiple campaigns going on at one time. The nice thing about our platform is it's easy to talk to each of those communities automatically by just posting a story, and then it talks to everybody for you.
Well, that sort of immediate impact, that feeling of satisfaction of seeing where your money is going, that really sort of evolved out of the crowdfunding sort of social media that driven kind of fundraising that millennials really sort of brought into the world. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's a way of, connecting to new donors? And I'm addressing this sort of well-known sort of issue with a lot of fundraisers and nonprofits in Canada of having been too dependent on boomers for historically for their donor base. And is this a way to bring young donors into their circle of donor engagement?
I really think it is. And one of the reasons it is because, first off, one of the things we see in social fundraising is much smaller gifts. So you're not necessarily going to get a one-time a year, someone cuts you $1,000 or a few $1,000 check. But there was interesting work done by the Gates Foundation on, if you want to increase donations, ask for smaller gifts. Just ask for them way more frequently. Because if we give $100 a month, for example, then in aggregate in the year, you're going to get $1,200 compared to the $1,000 gift that is a natural number at the end of the year. So millennial donors in particular are very interested in this kind of incremental work. And so if you can show them what their $100 will do, and so they give 100, show them what that 100 did. A quick little story for, you're not telling what their specific 100 did, but you're telling about that last group of people that contributed, what they accomplished. They're willing to give again because they want to see the result. And that's trust in charities is at an all-time low. And part of that is because of it's opaque. It's very hard to see the result. So when charities have learned that they show the results very quickly, trust builds and their donations build, and especially with younger donors, because it's kind of the way they're expecting it. They get to see that. So it is a really good way to attract donors. And the other thing, the reason it's good is because in social fundraising, we get them to share the fact that they've made an impact on the campaign. We're not asking them to brag about how much money they gave. We're asking them to say what they accomplished. So if $100 fed a woman and her child for a month and gave them personal protective equipment in the pandemic, they'll share that they helped a woman stay safe in the pandemic. And in their social network, their friends look at that and go, I can do that. And that's when you'll attract a net new donor. So in the old school where we take a check and they'd mail it into us, that's wonderful. But it's almost a waste to take a contribution like that now if we can't get the donor to talk to their friends and become an advocate for you, for your cause, to their community. They voted with their hard-earned dollars. When they tell people about it, others are more likely to vote too.
Right. And I guess this is a large part of actually building up a donor base and reaching out, engaging and maintaining donors, is using these personal networks of the people who are committed to your cause.
Yeah. I try and encourage everyone to think of it that you're really building a community of advocates. The donations are a side effect. When people feel strongly about your mission and what you're accomplishing and feel like they're part of that mission, that they're going to help you get there, then they're more likely to talk about you. They're proud of it and they're excited about the work you're doing. That just money tends to fall out from that point as opposed to be the primary reason why you're doing it. It works really, really well. When we've seen it work, it can work incredibly well because these donors become very loyal and they're willing to go to great lengths to support the cause, more than you might expect.
Well, I wondered if, looking back for the last 18, 19 months, did the pandemic reveal fundamental weaknesses in the traditional forms of fundraising that forced fundraisers and organizations to embrace different models for the long term? I mean, we've talked about digitization, but is this sort of the silver lining to a very, very dark cloud?
I'm hoping it is. I'm noticing a little bit of what I call snapback right now. So everyone learned. First off, to answer the first part of your question, it became very clear that the sector is overly dependent on in-person events and on boomer donors. They didn't know how to cultivate this online community of younger donors. So when the pandemic happened and they couldn't reach the donors in the regular way, they really had some problems. And so many of them adjusted. And we learned how to do virtual events, virtual runs and walks and rides. We've got some great examples of those, and virtual galas. But one of the things I'm seeing now is that with the vaccines coming on and are opening up our society again, I'm seeing a snapback. It's almost like we're forgetting very quickly. Oh yeah, well, I can hardly wait to do our gala again. But wait, you remember that it's really expensive. It's not very fundraising efficient. You spend all this effort and you spend a whole bunch of money on food and entertainment and things like that that detract from your mission. Why are we doing that again? But it's because it's convenient and people enjoy the experience. And I think the people that are running it enjoy the experience as much as the people that are attending. So the snapback is worry because this pandemic is not over yet. It's it's a mutating beast, and we'll see where it goes. But I think we should be planning for a continued presence of challenges in our physical world for a while.
Well, I happen to agree with you. I mean, that being said, human beings seem to be hardwired for social interactions, but it would seem to me that what you're suggesting is, at a minimum, that digital strategies should be part of a diversification of fundraising strategies.
Very much. And let me give you an example of, you mentioned that we're social people. So one of the groups out of Ontario is called iTeams, and they run an event called Run for Romania every year, where they bring fundraisers together and they support their operations in both Canada and Romania. So what they did was they can't do the normal in-person fundraising events that they've done before. So they did a virtual walk or run. And what they did is they got their fundraisers to sign up. And then those fundraisers, when they were walking or running, took selfies and little videos of themselves and posted it to their campaign pages and shared it with everyone. They raised, I think it was 50% more than they normally did in a year last year. They ran it again this year with a bigger goal, and they raised more again than they had, so their goal increased. And what they discovered was by having people share in that way, people were just walking their neighborhood and taking selfies of themselves. They said the connection of people from Canada to Romania and within Canada and Romania was much stronger. And as a result, people had a much better time doing the event. And whoa, look at that. They raised more money. They felt like they got to see each other, even though they were only relying on technology for that. So the community aspect of it came out strongly, even though it was virtual.
Well, despite your observation of the seemingly snapback experience that is occurring to many nonprofits embracing in-person events again as restrictions lighten up, we seem to have reached a tipping point, however, that many of the digital innovations are likely here to stay. Is that your expectation? And what do you see for the future of fundraising, both in this season of giving in 2021 and into 2022 and beyond?
I think you're right. I think that these innovations are here to stay, for mainly because the boomers are moving on, and they won't be around forever. And so we'll have to dealing with the younger audiences and the digital donors. I call them digital donors because I don't think millennials is appropriate. A digital donor is someone who prefers to deal with your organization digitally. That's all. We have grandmothers and grandfathers who are digital donors who really can't understand why they ever want to cut a check again. They're into digital banking. They're into using their tablet to communicate on everything. So it's not necessarily an age thing. It's more about digital donor behavior. And so I think we're going to have to address digital donors and come to them where they live and make it easy for them, make it attractive for them to engage with your cause. That part's not going to change. I think it's going to accelerate. And I hope it will, because it can be much more efficient in communicating with for the organization, with their donor base, and the donors can feel much more included. And that strengthens the work that we're doing, because it's one thing to kind of toil away in silence and try and do these works. It's another thing to have a group around you going, go for it. I love it. Please do more of that. The feedback is good for both sides of the deal. I think the causes revel in some of the attention that comes back, because it's an affirmation of the work they're doing all the time. And that's really important.
That's important for employee engagement for nonprofits as well, then.
Because there's such a high turnover in fundraisers. I mean, it's a hard job to be asking in that way. But I know that when the organization takes the time to think about the impact that they're making, we really encourage people to talk about units of impact when they're telling their crowdfunding story. So if someone gives you $50, what does that actually accomplish? If they give you $100, what does that accomplish? And then talk about things in terms of unit of impact. You gave to feed a mom and her child. That's a lot different than you gave $100. It's much more understandable and impactful emotionally for a donor and for the community around them. So when we can talk about these things, we can really encourage people to give more. And that's a challenge for many organizations, to learn how to tell these stories. I did a TED Talk on something called micro projects. Basically, the topic was philanthropy, binge watching for good, using philanthropy as an entertainment device. And it gets into the idea is, if we can tell the stories of these causes and the impacts that they're creating, people will give repeatedly, like $10 a month, $20 a month, $50 a month. And they may not do it in a recurring basis. Millennials don't necessarily like to commit. They want to, I'll give you $50, but I'll give you $50 again next month. But I want to keep my powder dry just in case a better opportunity comes up. And that's the way they date. That's the way they everything, right? Especially Gen Z. They're not necessarily willing to commit to that. But if you give them a good reason, they still want to donate. So we can tease out of them and make them happier about it by telling these kind of stories. So we just say, figure out how to break up the work you're doing into small little chunks, so it's really easy to see the impact. We call those micro projects. And a lot of causes come to us and they go, I don't get it. This is the kind of work we do. We don't understand our micro impacts. And this is where an outsider perspective can really help, to get somebody to say, what is the work you're doing, and break it up into little chunks for you, and then talk about those chunks, because that's what people will fund. So I have yet to find a cause that hasn't got a great micro project story, but everyone is absolutely convinced that they don't have one when they start. It is just a different perspective.
Just to sort of paint the picture for the fundraiser or the organization, can you give an example of a good micro giving kind of campaign?
I'm going to give you two because they're kind of funny. One of them is pretty easy to see. If you're training if your organization trains guide dogs for the blind, your annual budget is going to be, millions to do this potentially. Because each of these dogs is quite expensive, $15,000 to $35,000, depending on the kind of training that they get for blind or for comfort dogs and things like that. But if you break up the budget and start talking about one of the dogs at a time, so in my TED Talk, I call him Apollo. If you talk about Apollo and you show puppy pictures of Apollo, the vest doesn't fit, it's all paws and all head and no body. And you start showing photos and tell the story of Apollo's training and what he's doing and his successes and his failures. It becomes a little bit like an episodic TV show where you've got, weekly updates on how Apollo's doing. So if somebody starts to give towards Apollo, all sorts of things may happen. He may have had an accident and broke his leg trying to do something. So he needs a vet bill. You can ask the community to support the vet bill for Apollo. If you do it well, you can get someone supporting Apollo, and they'll enroll their friend to support Bravo, and somebody else will enroll somebody to support Charlie. And now your storytelling can be done by the trainers. They can just take a few photos and a quick video every once in a while, post it to the community. And this is where that auto segmentation part of the campaign storytelling really works. You can really significantly increase the funding that's available for that. But you can go, okay, well, Apollo's all cool, guide dogs, it's all cuddly. My cause isn't like that. We have a cause out of the US called the Commemorative Air Force. And they use micro projects to restore old warplanes. So each warplane has its own story, and they post updates around the warplane, and they get people who contribute on a regular basis to help restore these warplanes. Some of the storytelling is a little different than you might expect. One of the planes is a trainer that was used in the war as all the men went off to war. Women were involved in training the pilots. And so they told the story in light of Rosie the Riveter, this plane. They call it Rosie, and they explain how it matters. And it really shows the power of the storytelling, that they can get these planes funded, even though they're, old greasy bits of mechanics.
I'm curious whether, when you talk about storytelling in this manner, do you ever get pushback from, I guess, more traditional fundraisers or organizations that have been around for a while, that they just don't feel comfortable doing that?
Yeah, it's very astute observation. A lot of them are uncomfortable at the level of transparency. There's a difference in a generational difference, I think. At times, older generations tended to be professional. They wanted to have professional communications and all polished communications, everything lined up and perfected. And one of the things about millennial donors and Gen Z donors and that is that they like authentic. They want to see it raw. So they don't appreciate the professionalism. It feels slick or feels manipulative to them. And so when you're authentic, hey, oops, we screwed up. We did this. We were recording this video. It didn't quite work, but we showed it to you anyway, because that's all we're going to do today. We don't have time to do it again. And digital donors tend to go, oh, cool. They're being real. And so they're more attractive, funny enough, without the perfection. And that can be a hard transition for people who are used to kind of polishing what everything shows. I think that's probably one of the biggest differences between the generations, is the tolerance for imperfection and just acceptance of it on a normal basis.
So Daryl, tell me about the Worry Monster.
Yeah, this was one of the campaigns that I was really enthused with that was running on Charity Village as a platform. There's a group called Pastone Foundation. I think it's in the Niagara area. And they provide counseling and other services to youth particularly. And one of the problems that they identified in the pandemic is that children were getting incredibly frightened. They're worried that their parents were going to die, that they'd be abandoned, that they had survival questions for themselves because they felt the news media was there. But I think more importantly, they probably saw the worry on their parents' faces and the adults around. And now we're all masking up, and there's personal protective equipment, and we're not allowed to be close to each other and whatever. And so Pathstone started their first crowdfunding campaign that they'd ever done, and they went after the idea of how can we help these children deal with the pandemic. So they had a therapy device called a Worry Monster doll. And basically it's a funny looking little doll. And the child would write down their worries on a piece of paper, unzip the mouth of the Worry Monster, and the Worry Monster would eat the worries up. And then they'd zip it back up. And when the child went in to see their counselor, they'd pull them out, they'd read the stories, and they could talk about them, talk about the issues. But until then, the Worry Monster is kind of taking care of it. And so they experimented with the way we suggest to tell a crowdfunding story, which is there's kind of 6 steps to it. You describe the problem. First off, you usually want to say something that everyone will agree with. So their statement in this case was, and I'm doing this by memory, but we'll see how it goes. But basically, we're all in this pandemic. All of us have been are affected in some way. Our mental health is a bit challenged. And then they describe the problem, that this is even more prevalent in some children who are really feeling unsettled. They don't have the kind of foundational knowledge to keep themselves safe in this. So they're feeling off balance. And so the potential solution to this, next thing you talk about solution, is we have this Worry Monster doll that as part of a counseling session, we can go to explain to them and help work through their worries. The next component of it is one that most causes miss, is what we call the gap. So the gap is, great, we have hundreds of kids that need these worry monsters. The gap, and we have some worry monsters available to us. The gap is we don't have the money to get them together. So now this is where you make the donor the hero. This is where you can help. If you can help us get worry monsters, we can help give these kids the counseling they need to keep healthy in this pandemic. Next part of the storytelling is quid pro quo. If the donor is going to give something to you, what is the cause going to give back to the donor? And the simplest thing to do is to share the results of the program. So they would talk about how many kids they're helping. They showed photos of all the worry monsters showing up at their offices, big stacks of these boxes. And the point is that it was very real. But they're using the campaign capabilities of the platform to distribute an update to the people who've already donated, going, look, we used your money already. Here are the monsters that we're buying. And unsurprisingly, a flood of more donations came back in because people were sharing that story to their friends and social media. More donations came in. And then they really nailed it in the end because they managed to get permission from one of the parents and one of the counselors to show their child being given the worry monster. And they videoed it. Oh, I cried. I mean, it was amazing. And what they said, they followed up with a story and said this little girl who hadn't slept in her own bed all year long slept 6 days in a row in her own bed. And every parent out there is going, yes, right? So the point is that their first crowdfunding campaign, they had lovely graphics. They had a lovely story to tell. They had a very impactful story. They used the reality of the pandemic to talk about the need, to talk about the gap, and to talk about the solution, and then to share the results. So it's a great thing that happened, but it was a voyage of discovery for this cause, the first time they were trying something like this.
Well, I think that story really shows that by storytelling, you can not just make an intellectual argument, but to really touch the heart of people that moves them to take action. And I think that is so valuable about this kind of method of engaging donors.
We like to think that we think rationally. We always think emotionally, and then we look for data to back up our belief, whatever that emotional belief is. So if we can get the emotions engaged and then provide just the minimum amount of information, they'll solve the rationality thing, because otherwise we overwhelm them with facts and figures, and we actually can kill off the emotional response by giving them too much data. So the little crowdfunding success story model is really short. You can get it all on one piece of paper, and it works really well.
Well, I can see why in this case. I mean, I could certainly use a worry monster in the last, this last year and a half for sure. What a fantastic idea, but what a wonderful story. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. And it shows the kind of great work that the causes are doing out there to rapidly respond to kids in crisis at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And demonstrates the kind of amazing creativity and innovation that the sector at large really demonstrated when this crisis hit. I mean, you had a first front row seat really to all of this kind of transformative, but also real creative kind of ideas that the nonprofit sector actually embraced in many cases to bring great campaigns.
Well, and one of the things that is important about what CharityVillage does and what we do in supporting our crowdfunding customers like this is it's not about supplying you the technology. It's also, we have to show techniques, and we have to invent new techniques and then share it with our community. So, as a CEO, I spend an extra amount of time right now working directly with our causes to try and understand the challenges they're facing and how to translate what we know, what we're seeing in the data across all the causes back into the results that they need to do for themselves. I really liked the webinars that we did at the end of the year last year, where we were showing with CharityVillage, where we were showing just basically look, this is what our customers are doing. I'm not here to sell you our platform. I just want to show you some of the techniques that people are using with these new digital fundraising techniques. And we're very anxious to share that. We know we got a great platform. I'm maybe arrogant about that. But what's more interesting is helping our causes do innovative things with it. And that's where the power of it really shows up. And the relationship that we're building with our customers jointly really works.
That's really fascinating. Well, since the pandemic we agree, is likely to be around for a while in some form or another, what is your best advice for organizations and charities to survive in the interim and to build a better future and really make their fundraising sources more sustainable? Can you give some advice to our audience?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question right now for sure. I think that the biggest thing is to, first off, even though we're in the middle of a crisis in many ways, to adopt a long-term thinking approach. We tend to band-aid things, and as a result, we're constantly having to band-aid it. But if we think about the long-term direction of how do we build a community of advocates that we can reach digitally and therefore cost-effectively to help sustain our mission, and now what can we do to do one piece of that right now? And typically that means do a pilot, do a trial, do a small segment of your audience. Start to work with them and see if you can grow that piece. Because we're having to train the organization, we're having to train the individuals, and we're having to train the donors about this is the way we're going to communicate with everyone. And so, if you set that path of long term, of that goal of that engaged digital community, then the steps to get there start to become clearer. The first one is just start. Pick a project, start talking about it, and see if you can get people to share about it.
I really appreciate you sharing your really astute and valuable insights on the innovations in fundraising, and in particular, how crowdfunding can help organizations really build a more sustainable and more diversified funding strategy for the future. So thank you so much, Daryl, for joining us.
My pleasure, always.